In this lesson, we're going to start a very realistic attack scenario, just a quick one that we can use in order to also then investigate what just happened within our lab environment. And to do so, we have two Windows clients set up. We really just need one because what we're going to be doing is we'll use PowerShell Empire, or also called Empire these days, to execute an attack on this client, install a persistence mechanism, and then just observe and respond to this just as we would do in real-world environments. And for this, we have the Windows client installed. You might have a server client set up. This is fine. We'll just focus on a single VM in this case. And then additionally, we need a Kali Linux VM in order to run the attack from it. Kali Linux comes with the Empire framework out of the box, so that's what we are going to be using as well, since it's a very realistic and actually a command and control framework that you see also often used out in the wild. Command and control frameworks typically operate in a server client way. That means that you can install a server somewhere out on the internet or in any place and location. You can connect to it through your client. In this case, we're going to do both, or we run both on the same environment. So we need to open up a terminal and just say sudo PowerShell Empire and say server in order to start up the server. But once the server is started up, we can then also open another tab and then start up the client, which is going to connect to the server, which we are then going to use to interact with. So once you see something like Empire starting up, we can then go ahead and create a new tab. We need to keep the server running and say sudo PowerShell Empire and just client. Start our client, connect to the server, and that's where we will be operating out of. So in a plain, fresh installation, you'll see we have no listeners and no agents. So first things first, what we need to do is we need to set up Empire and then create a payload that can be executed on the Windows client so that the Windows client then has a process running and checking in with our server to constantly listen for new commands and updates, which we then basically can use in order to control this VM. And to do so, the name already gave it away, we need to create a listener first of all, and then create a payload that is configured to check in with the listener and then execute it on the Windows box. So let's create a listener. In PowerShell Empire, we just do use listener. And then the most straightforward ways, there's a lot of different ways and protocols of how you can use this, but we just do use listener HTTP because that's very straightforward. And then we can see a number of options. There's a lot of things pre-configured and we just keep it that way to make it simple and straightforward. All we need though is we need to set up a port that we want to listening on for this payload when the payload gets executed. And then we also want to change the delay so that it's checking in every second so we don't have to wait for too long when we execute commands. So we'll go ahead and do set port, and this is case sensitive, very important. And I just use 9001. And we also want to do the default delay to 1 second. And I might also just set the name so that it's more clear. This is my HTTP 1, so this is the first HTTP listener that we're going to create. We won't need any other ones, but this is just best practices. And then we can do execute so that this listener is going to start up based on this configuration. Listener started. So now we need to create the payload that is going to be configured with the listener settings. And this is called a stager. A stager is basically the payload that is going to be executed on a Windows system, for example, in order to then pull down the configuration that it needs to continuously reach out to our command and control server. So that way, that means we can just type use stager. And the most straightforward one in our case, since we're dealing with a Windows system, is called Windows Launcher BAT or batch. So Windows Launcher BAT. So that's basically just a batch script. And for this, the requirements are that we need to set the listener that it should connect to. And that basically means the listener we just created. There's only one choice. And then this is going to create a launcher.batch file, which we need to run, get onto the host and run. And then it's also going to delete itself. That's some default configuration. There's some bypasses and everything. We don't need to worry about that yet. So let's just do execute. And this just created a file. And this file is written to the PowerShell Empire directory, and then client generated stager launch a bat. So this is what we need to get onto the system here, to the Windows system. Easiest way to do so is we can serve this directory up as a web service and then just use the browser on Windows to download this malicious file. For that, we need another tab and then just navigate to this particular directory. And this is now the directory that we want to serve as a web service. So we can just type python 3-m http.server. And now, based on this IP address of this Kali box and port 8000, we should be able to see files that are contained within this environment, or within this directory. So now it's time to move over to our Windows victim VM and run this payload. And there's lots of ways how these kind of payloads are typically delivered. As we know, tons of phishing attachments that are malicious, or other kinds of malware that might run first of all in order then to pull down a stager like this, and then that would then facilitate command and control communication. So for the sake of a scenario, we just go ahead and say somebody made us click on a link, which is HTTP, and then basically our Kali Linux IP address, and then port 8000. And just to check in here, we can see there's a file located called launch a batch. This is exactly what we need. So we could have had a link in a phishing email, for example, that would have made us download this one right away. Once we click on it, we can find it in our downloads folder. Very important, all Windows Defender or antivirus features turned off, because obviously this is a very commonly used payload, or a very well-known payload. This would otherwise be deleted. But that's true for any kind of lab environment that we are dealing with a very basic scenario. All right, so first things, before we click on this, we want to move back to Kali and just watch the client, because what we are hoping for is that this stager, once executed, is going to check in with our client. And basically what this batch script does is it's going to execute a PowerShell payload that is going to check in with our listener. And the listener is then serving configuration that is going to create a new process here. And then this process is going to check in with our Kali or Empire command and control server every second based on our configuration. And now we can see, this is what we want to see, a new agent has checked in. So we can type agents to find the agents that we connected with. And here we can see it's green, so it's still alive. And there is the IP address, the user that clicked on it. So my user was Alice. It's running under a PowerShell process, and the delay is 1 second. And we last seen is basically just now. In order to use this agent, we can now interact with it. So there's a command interact, and then this randomly assigned name for the stager is what we need to use in order to interact with this agent. So now we can basically do anything we want with this system based on the modules that are available, or we can also connect and get a shell and run anything we want. If we just type info, we can see information about this command and control communication, which is high integrity false. So this means that we are not running as a high integrity process. That means we cannot execute anything that would require administrator privileges. We'd still have to do a USC bypass, for example, a user account control bypass, to execute anything that requires high integrity. But other than that, we are pretty good. So one thing that we need to consider as an attacker, usually what they want to do is establishing persistence, right? And this is something where if the communication breaks, or if the system goes offline or gets rebooted, we still want to have the system check back in with our command and control server, so we can further our attack even after anything might happen. And to do so, the most commonly used way is to create persistence through scheduled tasks. So once we interact with an agent, we can type use module, and there's a ton of modules, but what we want is scheduled tasks. So just type schedule tasks like this. And then there's two options. Elevated would be for a high integrity process, but we are in the user land, so we need to do a user land scheduled task persistence. And once we're in there, we have options again, as always. And there's a lot of it already configured out of the box. All we need to say is which listener the scheduled task should be checking in on. And then we can see when it's going to be executed is every day at 9 a.m. So if we lose the connection here at the latest every day at 9 a.m., this scheduled task should be checking in with our command and control server again. There's also the scheduled task name. And there's also a location where the payload is going to be stored. And this is going to become really important later on for the investigation. There's also some proxy settings you can set up, but we don't need anything of that. We'll just do setting the listener. And then we can type execute. And that's it. We just created a scheduled tasks on the system and still have a command and control session established with this VM. We could now go ahead, obviously, and carry out the rest of the attack, which might, for example, be privilege escalation, credential dumping, lateral movement, identifying critical systems, the domain controller, for example, establishing more persistence in order to achieve the objectives of whatever this attack might be. But for this, I think this is enough for the attack to just demonstrate a quick and easy way of how we can attack our systems. And we'll now switch over to focus on the investigation side of things. For the investigation, we need something to trigger it. And in this case, we can just say, hey, there's an event. Let's say user Alice actually experienced some abnormal performance issues, or maybe we got an alert because of a suspicious command and control or suspicious IP address or domain that this system just connected to. So let's assume we want to actually, as a security analyst, perform a quick triage analysis based on the activities or events that just happened recently on this system. And to do so, we'll start with Splunk. We'll then perform a quick analysis using Velociraptor and then pull the data, forensics data, down offline in order to manually look further into what happened. Okay, so based on our simplified lab scenario, we can say that we have identified the destination IP address that our source system was communicating with. There's a very suspicious pattern of beaconing. So let's perform additional analysis. Let's just jump into the Velociraptor tool. There is an interesting task directly in the tasks root directory called updater. And this task is going to run a PowerShell process where the PowerShell process has some interesting arguments, which is non-interactive, hidden window, and invoke, execute, anything which is a base 64 string that is stored within what it appears a registry key. Let's just collect registry hives. This one, the one below here, looks like what we are looking for. Software Microsoft Windows current version. Debug is the value name. Double click on it. And it dropped us right in there, the directory current version. In current version, there's one value stored within this key, which is called debug. Debug has data. And down here, we can see what kind of data this is. That's the value. And this is basically what the scheduled task is going to pull and execute when it's basically triggering. So now we have the plain text and basically the PowerShell payload that is going to be executed with the scheduled tasks as a persistence mechanism.